President Trump, he attacks the Justice Department again, but this time many are saying he may have crossed a line and even possibly starting a constitutional crisis. Then, while kids were recovering in the hospital from the latest school shooting, Trump was tweeting nonstop this weekend about Russia, the FBI, barely a mention about what happened in Texas. We're going to take a look at the reaction to the tragedy and also the latest when it comes to the investigation. Also, what do you do if you're a Democrat in the midterms when it comes to a strategy? Do they talk about impeachment? Do they make it all about Trump? Or could both those plans backfire come November? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Hope you had a great weekend, and thank you for joining us. Well, President Trump, he met today with FBI Director Chris Wray and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. White House says the meeting previously scheduled, but it did come amid a flurry of Trump tweets over the weekend, all blasting the Russia investigation as politically motivated and a witch hunt. The President directly went after the Justice Department more strongly than he ever has. Trump is also demanding an investigation into the Russia investigation overall, and Rosenstein has confirmed that the Inspector General's office of the DOJ will be looking into whether the probe is politically motivated. Trump also wants the FBI to release confidential documents on their operation, something that they very rarely do. But in the middle of all that, Trump started his day at Langley. At CIA headquarters, President Trump swearing in the agency's first female director, Gina Haspel. This just hours after the president took a shot at the former CIA director, John Brennan, quoting this Fox News analyst.
John Brennan has disgraced himself. He's disgraced the country.
The president tweeting those insults, along with a false claim that Brennan launched the investigation. It was actually former FBI director James Comey. Mr. Trump even quoting a suggestion that Brennan deserves jail time, tweeting, "This guy is the genesis of this whole debacle. This is a political hit job. This was not an intelligence investigation. Brennan has disgraced himself. He's worried about staying out of jail." This weekend, President Trump announced on Twitter that he's acting on his often repeated threat to intervene in the Russian probe, tweeting, "I hereby demand that the Director of Justice look into whether or not the FBI DOJ infiltrated or surveilled the Trump campaign for political purposes, and if any such demands or requests were made by people within the Obama administration." This follows a report in the New York Times that the FBI sent a confidential informant to speak to two Trump campaign advisors who had made suspicious contacts with the Russians before the election. The FBI will not confirm that it used a secret informant, but last week the director did speak about the need to keep informants' identities and activities secret.
The day that we can't protect human sources is the day the American people start becoming less safe.
But today, the president is asking for more. He wants the FBI to share confidential documents of their investigation into him and his campaign, tweeting, "Only the release or review of documents can give the conclusive answers." And we're learning late this afternoon that certain members of Congress, a limited audience, will be able to see some of this information. Now, a lot of reaction to what happened over the course of the weekend from the president. California Congressman Adam Schiff, who's the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, said this.
President's suggestion by Giuliani that there is a political spy embedded in the Trump campaign is nonsense. And you hear it in the same terms that Trump often speaks, which is people are saying, or I'm hearing, or we're being told. That's another way of saying this is patently untrue, but we would like to spread it anyway. And it's singularly destructive of our institutions, but then that's the point.
Now, in terms of the consequences of all this, the breakdown in trust of not only government agencies, but the government itself and the motivations, listen to the person that obviously Donald Trump beat to be in the Oval Office, one Hillary Clinton. This is part of her commencement speech this past weekend at Yale.
Right now, we're living through a full-fledged crisis in our democracy. Now, there are not tanks in the streets, but what's happening right now goes to the heart of who we are as a nation. And I say this not as a Democrat who lost an election, but as an American afraid of losing a country.
Now, there has been many developments, as there seemingly is every single news cycle when it comes to the Russia probe. Rudy Giuliani, he is at it again. He said that Bob Mueller shared his timeline with him and said the obstruction probe should be done by September 1. But the special counsel's office has not confirmed that, and a report by Reuters says no such date was ever uttered. Donald Trump Jr., he also back in the news. Mueller team looking at yet another meeting he had with foreign officials who are rooting for his father. Now, this one took place 3 months before Election Day. It was at Trump Tower, just like his infamous meeting with the Russians. This time, Donnie Jr. met with an Israeli social media expert and also officials from the United Arab Emirates as well as Saudi Arabia. Times reporting those emissaries wanted to help Trump win. Okay, a lot to unpack here. Let's bring in our panel to help us with that. Amy Siskine, she's the president of The New Agenda, also author of The List. That's required reading for all. Molly Fullington, she is Republican strategist. And to her right, Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. So there's a lot that came out. And while it's not by any means illegal or beyond the president's powers to demand basically the DOJ looks into this, Andrew, there was a sense from a lot of people that there was a line that wasn't just an angry tweet this weekend. We went to a different place we weren't before.
Two concerns on that front. One is that you're politicizing the DOJ, and it's the president basically asking the Department of Justice to investigate his political opponents, or the people he now views as being his political opponents. In this case, some of them are political figures, and others are career DOJ members.
Because he specifically, to your point in those tweets, mentioned that the Obama administration had authored or approved the spy to look into the campaign.
Correct. The other avenue of concern is that this continues to be problematic. And I'm sorry, I've lost my thread.
But it's also like who's in charge, who's investigating who, in effect here. The people that are investigating and launching a probe into this seemingly oversight as it relates to Mueller, they're now the ones that not only are trying to discredit here, but also investigate.
And some questions as to whether the Trump administration was fishing for information about the current state of the investigation and looking to help bolster their own defense. And there was also a considered risk that Rosenstein might reject this request from Trump, and that would give Trump leverage to then fire him and go after Bob Mueller.
And he really had to thread a needle. Molly, is there a point where, listen, I'm sure no Republican strategist would want to be rooting for Hillary Clinton here, but did she have a point that we're getting to a place? I mean, if you think about some of the people that he went after, from the Comeys to the Muellers, certainly, to the Brennans, these are people who identified as Republicans their whole lives. They just happen to be part of the Department of Justice or the FBI or whatever the case may be, that they're all corrupt, they're all part of a witch hunt, they're all part of a cabal, the deep state. Is there a worry that even after the midterms, whatever happens, we're not going to be able to get back what we've lost in the last 20 months as it relates to faith in government and faith in justice?
I don't believe that. I mean, I don't think this is a constitutional crisis. I'm not an expert on the Constitution, but I think we put our faith, or this country put its faith in Robert Mueller, who was 1 year ago described by both sides of the aisle, folks on both sides of the aisle, as the perfect person to put this forth. And I think in the end, let this take this investigation.
And Molly, I've heard that point from other Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, says, oh, we don't need to have a vote to basically affirm Mueller's power. We don't need to have a protection for him because he's fine. We would never let anything happen. But we've seen a lot of things where people that I never would have thought would have swallowed hard and went along to go along, including people really critical of Trump, the candidate, even before he got the nomination, even after he got the nomination, that have stayed silent in the last year and a half. The contrary to a McCain, the contrary to a Flake here or a Corker and the rest. Are you surprised that a lot in the Republican Party have stayed silent when he's done things, forget Democrats, that are just against national interest?
I think the line here is if President Trump fires Robert Mueller or fires Rod Rosenstein, that's when things change. And I think
how confident are you of that? Because I've heard a lot of people say that will be a line. But each passing week or month, they'll look at the Devin Nuneses of the world and say, I don't know.
I'd like to believe it. I'd also say for Republicans who are running for re-election and who are running, period, if they are running in a Republican district, there are a lot of people in that district who are major Trump supporters. So they're put in quite a position. they have to figure out how do we get our voters to vote for us so that we can stay here and have influence.
And we'll be talking about the midterm strategies for both parties a little later in the program. Amy, you chronicle, and unfortunately for you, you don't have quiet weekends with all the tweeting, but you chronicle all of this. Did this seem like the same thing you've been covering for going on more than a year and a half now, or did this feel different, what happened this weekend?
Well, things are escalating. My weekly list last week was 176 items, and as we were closing out last week, we basically outed an informant. The name was made public by first the New York Times and the Washington Post, then NBC News actually put it out there. So this kind of stuff is shocking. To me, it's not Republican, Democrat. I mean, the idea of going after our own institutions is uniquely Trump. What he's trying to do is delegitimize the investigation before it's completed.
Without any evidence, we should just enforce that, Amy. I don't want to interrupt you, but the idea, if we just step back for a second, take all our partisan blinders off, the reason why this person was put on this to investigate was they had credible evidence that the Russians were trying to marginalize and interfere with our election. Now, everybody you would think of both political parties would say, we want to have legitimate democratic elections in this country that are not interfered by a foreign power, certainly an enemy to national interests. So that's why this person was put on. We have no evidence at this point to say those political motivations or anything, or even anything even came out of it.
Exactly. And it's the same theme. In my book, I talk about the Obama wiretap, and that went on for weeks and weeks, and he kept saying he was going to produce evidence, and that never happened. What happens is people like us who are so engaged in politics understand what is happening, but people that are sort of watching from the sideline and hear that Rosenstein capitulated yesterday and they're actually going to investigate whether that happened. My fear is to an outsider that legitimizes what Trump is saying.
That there was a spy,
that really
right? That's the
concerned
word they'll
me,
remember from
that
the story,
they were
a spy.
spying, that Hillary or Obama was spying for us, which is absurd, but it's like a theater right now. And he's trying to take down the very institutions that are designed to protect us.
But if you think it's absurd that the Obama and Clinton camps were spying somehow on the Trump campaign, why not allow some level of investigation of DOJ policies and procedures on this?
They are.
No, and I understand that. And again, I don't want this to be discovery in this case. I don't want them handing over evidence or information to the Trump White House because charges haven't been brought yet. And my biggest concern here is that Devin Nunes will be on the list of people who get to see some of this information from DOJ, and he'll start leaking it either to the White House or the public.
You know why it bothered me at least was, I don't know if you agree, Molly, if this was done at the end of a gun, which was, there wasn't a legitimate, there was a story comes out, and by the way, the Times and the Post, so this isn't like, Breitbart coming out with something. So there's a legitimate story. The president basically ordering and threatening, and yes, he can ask, that's the right of a president, he's not the first president to do it. But it seemed as if you're my Justice Department, you work for me, you'll do the following, and by the way, he mentioned, Brennan wasn't even the FBI director when this happened. James Comey was.
The words were, I hereby demand.
Right.
When does that happen? What other democracies around the world say, I hereby demand? None.
You can't really defend the tweeting. It's very difficult to defend the tone of the tweets. It's difficult to defend how he is handling this, but I would still say it's a distraction in a lot of ways. We do need to let this investigation go forward. There are issues that are enormous that are happening around this world, and the media is, of course, and I understand why, focused on Trump spinning this up, we're spinning it up on the media side, and it is a continual cycle that seems to never end.
But it's not just the investigation. It's the investigation then what happens with the results once Mueller comes back with the results. And if this is the Trump administration trying to undermine Mueller and undermine DOJ so that no matter what the result of his investigation is, that he has a political bulwark in Congress to prevent him from being impeached or censured or any other penalty, then that's sort of hamstrings the investigation anyway. I mean, it's not just what Mueller finds, but what we do about it. And if all of this is just to try to, undermine Mueller's findings before he even comes to them, that's still problematic.
I guess for me, and I look at you as the poor person probably more than any on this planet who has to keep track of all this, okay? But we're not even talking, because you're right, Mom. We get lost in the weeds and stuff, but this is the president who's doing this. So, but Rudy Giuliani claimed, not for the first time, but again, that he was told by the Mueller folks this would be done by September 1. Reuters is reporting that nobody from the Mueller probe, and we've heard from no one that corroborates that whatsoever. That's one. He's the president's attorney. And once again, either he's getting it wrong or he's misleading the public.
We're normalizing lying.
And the president says that we're going to lock up Brennan, who wasn't even the FBI director at the time. He says arrest and put in jail.
This
we
is
just
stuff
ignore this because
dictators
it happens
do.
every
Yes.
day, but it's crazy.
Well, I mean, it's not that we're ignoring it, it's more that we're normalizing it. And the stuff that we're not talking about, him calling first undocumented immigrants animals, and then upping that to today being violent animals. The fact that ICE is arresting people because they speak Spanish today in the Washington Post. Those are all the stories that aren't getting played. So week by week, things are escalating and getting worse. And you're talking things now that a dictator does, not in a democracy. Communicating by Twitter. The fact that all this arose by a communication on Twitter yesterday.
And we couldn't
on
get
Sunday.
any answers because the briefing today didn't happen again. This is ramping up to something, and like the three of you, I have no idea how this thing ends, when it ends, midterms, etc. But again, we'll be talking about that later. But I will say one thing that wasn't tweeted about much this weekend from the president's account was the tragedy that happened in Texas. We're going to take a look at the latest school shooting and how these things, sadly, don't even shock many of us since they've become just all so common.